equality between people and people from different countries or cultures were not something that were very common in the 1800s or the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And this is something that is brought to light in the poem White Man's Burden. The poem were published in the journal in 1899 and was written by Rudyard Kipling, who was a strong believer in imperialism and expansion of the big Western empires. This belief is something that is clearly seen in this poem, which will be explained in the following analysis. As mentioned, the poem was written in 1899, which is obviously seen in on the language, where some of the elements in the language are a bit different or spelled a bit differently to what we're used to today. And we see an example of that in stanza 5, line 3 to 5, where the word ye is used multiple times. And the word ye is a word that were used in Middle English and early modern English, so not a word that we are particularly familiar with today. This word is what we today know as the word you. And we do also see other non-modern day words and phrases like this throughout the poem, but it's not something that affects the overall understanding of the message and the poem itself, so it's not that big of a deal. In the poem, we do also shortly see especially one mode of appeal, which is ethos, given the fact that the sender is who he is, Rudyard Kipling, who was at the time a well-known poet of imperialism, which resulted in him having a certain amount of credibility, which meant that people were listening to him, and resulted in the American imperialist listened to him and understood the phrase "take up the white man's burden" as to justify imperial conquest as a mission of civilization. The poem is structured chronologically and contains multiple rhymes, which are often seen in poems like this. And in this poem, we see an example of it in stanza 2, line 2 to 4. Sounds like this: in patience to abide, to wield the thread of terror, and check the show of pride. In this case, it's an end rhyme that is used, and a rhyme like this increases the tempo and creates a flow and a rhythm in the poem, which makes it more interesting and also easier in some cases to read or to listen to for the reader or the listener. Regarding structure, we do see that every stanza is initiated with the phrase "take up the white man's burden," which also gives or creates sort of a flow when reading or listening to it, and does obviously also indicate the start of a new stanza. But more importantly, when something is repeated this many times, there is often a message to be taken from this particular phrase, which I'll explain later. In connection to this poem and to the time within it's written or published, strings can obviously be pulled to imperialism, which is also one of the big themes in the poem. But an essential theme is also a theme like responsibility, because the sender of the poem encourages the American people especially to build an empire like the Brits, given the fact that they at the time were very developed, so to speak, and civilized, but especially developed both technologically and also financially, which according to Rudyard Kipling gave them a certain responsibility in regard of helping other countries who are not as fortunate to moving in the right direction towards becoming a civilized, developed country as well. This theme connects well with the overall message of the poem, which is sort of the same thing, that the well developed and the civilized nations should lead other countries who are not as fortunate in the right direction. And in this case, according to Rudyard Kipling, the answer to this, or the way to help, was to civilize or try to civilize their countries by establishing colonies in the countries and helping the people living in the countries and the countries themselves to move in the right direction and become civilized countries too. To sum up the analysis, it can be concluded that the language of the poem reflects the historical time in which the poem is written, given the fact that some of the words and phrases are a little different to how we know them today in modern day English. The poem does also contain especially one mode of appeal, which is ephes, due to the fact that the center of the poem is Rudyard Kipling, who, as I mentioned before, was a well-known and also respected poet of imperialism, which resulted in people listening to his words and putting them into actions. And in the poem, Kipling uses especially end rhymes, which creates a flow and a tempo in the poem and a rhythm, which makes it more interesting and easier to read and listen to. And as I mentioned, every stanza is initiated with the phrase, "Take up the white man's burden," which is closely connected to the themes and the messages, or the message of the poem. And the main themes are, as I just mentioned, imperialism and responsibility, which is closely connected or linked to the message, which is based on reaching out to the civilized and well-developed Western countries who, according to Kipling, had a certain obligation and responsibility to help other not as fortunate countries in the right direction by establishing colonies in the countries, and through that helping the people and the country in the right direction, in the direction of becoming a more as I mentioned, a more civilized country, like especially at this time the Western countries.